The air in the briefing tent at FOB Nightingale tasted of copper and baked earth. Outside, a wind that carried no relief, only grit, whipped canvas against aluminum poles. Inside, the crisis was absolute. A map of the Tangi Valley flickered on the projector screen, a red circle pulsing around a rocky outcrop designated Objective Raptor. "Hammerfall team is pinned down," Colonel Matson stated, his voice as dry as the surrounding desert. His jaw was a hard line of authority, his eyes sweeping over the assembled pilots and crew of the C-130J, callsign Goliath 2-2. "They're taking effective fire from ridgeline positions, their comms are sporadic, and they have 3 wounded, 1 critical. The window for extraction is closing." He pointed to a swirling, malevolent mass of meteorological data encroaching from the west. "And this bastard, a Khurasan dust storm with embedded cumulonimbus, is about to shut down all air operations for the next 12 hours. If we don't get them now, we won't get them at all." In the back of the tent, away from the circle of pilots in their sand-colored flight suits, Captain Eva Rostova stood perfectly still. She was on the manifest as a mission coordinator, a bureaucratic tag for an extra body meant to liaise with the Special Forces team once they were aboard. To the flight crew, she was ballast, dead weight. Her flight suit was immaculate but unadorned, lacking the squadron patches and inside joke insignia that marked the others as part of the tribe. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe regulation bun. Her face was a study in neutrality, revealing nothing of the calculations spooling behind her gray eyes. She watched the data on the screen, not the man speaking. Major Davis, the aircraft commander, a pilot whose confidence bordered on theatrical, stepped forward. "We can make it, Colonel. We'll fly a nap of the Earth profile up the valley floor, pop up at the LZ, and be out before the storm's leading edge hits." His co-pilot, Captain Foley, nodded in perfect, practice sync. "The ingress route takes you adjacent to the Zagros foothills." Eva's voice was quiet, yet it cut through the low murmur of the tent. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, and it carried an unexpected weight. Every head turned. "The storm front will create severe orographic lift on the windward side and catastrophic downdrafts on the leeward. Your planned route puts you directly in the rotor wash zone. You'll be fighting vertical shears exceeding 5,000 feet per minute." A dismissive silence followed. Major Davis let out a short, humorless laugh. "Thanks for the weather report, Captain. I think we can read our own charts." Colonel Madson's gaze settled on her, cold and impatient. "Your role is to handle the passengers once they are on the plane, Rostova. Let's leave the aviation to the aviators." The finality in his tone was a slammed door. He turned back to the map, the subject closed. "Wheels up in 20. Get it done." The pilots filed out, a tight knot of swagger and inside jokes. Eva remained for a moment, her eyes still on the map, watching the angry red pixels of the storm crawl inexorably toward the fragile blue icon of Hammerfall team. She was ignored, a ghost in the machine of war. But she could feel the air pressure changing, a familiar drop that promised violence. She knew the sky that was coming. She knew it in her bones. The plane, the crew, the men on the ground, they were flying into a meat grinder, and she was the only one who seemed to hear the blades spinning. She finally turned and walked out of the tent, her expression unchanged, her purpose hardening into a cold, dense point of focus. The time for words was over. The dismissal in the briefing room was a familiar sting, a low-grade hum of institutional friction she had grown accustomed to. Colonel Madson's clipped words were not personal. They were systemic. She was an anomaly on the flight manifest, a square peg in a round hole, and the system did not like anomalies. As she walked toward the flight line, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows across the tarmac, she could hear Davis and Foley laughing a few paces ahead. "Did you hear that?" Davis said, his voice carrying easily on the dry wind. "Vertical shears. Sounds like she swallowed a textbook." Foley chuckled. "Probably worried we'll spill her coffee, sir." "Mission coordinator. What does that even mean?" "Paperwork at 10,000 feet. Eva kept her pace steady, her gaze fixed on the hulking silhouette of the C-130J Super Hercules waiting under the floodlights. "Goliath 2-2. The aircraft was a beast of burden, designed for reliability, not grace. Its four massive props drooped in the still air. To Davis, it was a tool. To Eva, it was a living thing with moods and tolerances she understood on a level that transcended manuals. She had spent more hours in simulators and wind tunnels analyzing the C-130's flight envelope than Davis had spent in the air. She knew the precise angle of attack at which its wings would protest, the exact rudder input needed to correct a slip in a crosswind, the harmonic frequency of the Allison engines when they were perfectly in sync. Her input about the orographic lift wasn't from a textbook. It was from a painful, visceral memory. A memory of a test flight in a different aircraft, in a different sky, where a computer model had failed to predict the mountain's fury. That memory was etched into a thin, silvery scar above her right eyebrow, usually hidden by her hair. Madsen's skepticism was the easiest to ignore. He was a commander, concerned with outcomes, not methods. He saw a pilot's wings and a mission roster. He saw a problem, Hammerfall, and a solution, Goliath 2-2. Her name on that roster, with her non-standard title, was just noise in the signal. It was the pilot's casual derision that was more corrosive. They were the new generation, confident in their glass cockpits and flight management systems. They flew the computer and the computer flew the plane. They had forgotten how to feel the air, how to listen to the groans of an airframe under stress. She watched them climb the ladder into the cockpit, their movements full of the easy confidence of men who had never been truly tested, who had never felt an aircraft come apart around them. They believed the machine was infallible, and by extension, so were they. That was the mistake she had seen cost lives before. She paused at the bottom of the crew stairs, letting the ground crew swarm around the aircraft, their headlamps cutting swaths through the deepening twilight. The air was thick with the smell of jet fuel and ozone, a scent that for her was more comforting than perfume. This was her world. Even if they saw her as a tourist in it, she was home. She would go through her own checks, the ones that weren't on any official list. The pre-flight ritual was a silent conversation between her and the machine. While the official crew chief ran through his checklist with a clipboard and a bored expression, Eva began her own walk around, moving with an unhurried, methodical grace. She didn't just look. She touched. Her gloved fingers traced the seams of the fuselage panels, feeling for the slightest incongruity, the telltale vibration of a loose rivet. Her eyes scanned the wings not for general integrity, but for the subtle discolorations that might indicate fuel vapor leaks, invisible to a casual glance. She paused near the cockpit, just below the pilot's side window. Her gaze fell upon a patch of metal, slightly duller than the surrounding skin. It was a neat, flush-riveted repair, a scar from a previous mission where a piece of shrapnel had torn through the fuselage. She reached up and laid her palm flat against it, the cold aluminum a familiar anchor. It was a reminder of the aircraft's vulnerability, its mortality. A machine that had been wounded and healed just like the people who flew it. This was her symbolic touchstone, a moment of connection before trusting her life to the 2 million pounds of metal and wire. Moving toward the massive main landing gear, her eyes caught something. A faint, iridescent sheen on the black hydraulic lines, almost imperceptible against the dark rubber and metal. It was a whisper of a leak, a single drop of Skydral fluid weeping from a compression fitting. It was nothing that would ground the aircraft, not on a mission this critical. Most would have missed it entirely. She found the crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Wallace, signing off on his paperwork. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "check the outboard hydraulic line on the portside main gear. There's a weep at the upper fitting." Wallace looked up, annoyed at the interruption from the supernumerary officer. "The gear checked out green, ma'am. Pressure's holding steady." "Check it anyway," she insisted, her tone level, without challenge but leaving no room for argument. With an exasperated sigh, he grabbed a rag and a flashlight and slid under the fuselage. A moment later he emerged, wiping his hands. He looked at her differently. "Damn, you've got good eyes, Captain. It's a slow one, but it's there. I've tightened the fitting. Should hold." He gave her a nod of grudging respect. "Thanks." Watching from the top of the cargo ramp was Airman First Class Ben Carter, the loadmaster for the flight. He was young, barely 20, and this was his first deployment. He saw everything with the wide, observant eyes of someone who hadn't yet learned what to ignore. He'd seen the pilot's dismissal of Captain Rostova, and now he'd seen her spot a leak the veteran crew chief had missed. He noted the way she moved, with a quiet economy of motion, as if she were a part of the aircraft itself. He also noticed the patch on her right shoulder, almost hidden by the standard flag patch. It wasn't a unit insignia. It was a single, stylized silver wing, like a hawk's, with one feather sharply defined, as if breaking away. It was unique and it felt significant. He made a mental note of it as he began securing the cargo bay for the violent flight he knew was coming. Captain Rostova was more than just a coordinator. He wasn't sure what she was, but he knew dead weight wasn't it. The takeoff roll was a controlled earthquake. For Allison AE 2100D3 turboprops bit into the thick, humid air, screaming in protest as they hurled the 150,000-pound aircraft down the runway. Eva was strapped into the forward jump seat, just behind the cockpit. She didn't watch the instruments or the pilots. She closed her eyes and felt the plane. She felt the rumble of the tires on the tarmac transition to the lightness of flight, the precise moment of unsticking from the earth. She felt the gear retracting into the fuselage, the subtle shift in the center of gravity. Nightingale Tower, Goliath 2-2 is airborne, climbing to flight level 180 on course for Waypoint Alpha. Major Davis's voice was smooth, the practiced cadence of a professional broadcaster. In the calm air of the initial climb, his confidence returned. The ride was smooth for the first 20 minutes. Below, the desert landscape dissolved into a featureless brown canvas under the fading light. Then, ahead of them, the storm front appeared. It wasn't a bank of clouds. It was a wall, a solid, churning mass of black and bruised purple that boiled up from the horizon and scraped the stratosphere. Lightning spiderwebbed through its core, illuminating the monstrous internal structure for brief, terrifying seconds. "Looks like the weatherman was right for once," Foley said, a nervous edge creeping into his voice. "That's a big one." "Nothing Goliath can't handle," Davis replied, though he gripped the yoke a little tighter. "We'll stay low, use the terrain masking to stay out of the worst of it. Flight management system, follow pre-planned route." The first jolt hit them like a physical blow. The C-130 groaned, its wings flexing as an invisible hand swatted it from the sky. On the instrument panel, the vertical speed indicator plunged. Coffee sloshed from a cup holder, spattering the center console. "Whoa, little bumpy," Davis grunted, making a sharp control input that only seemed to worsen the oscillation. Eva remained still, her body absorbing the turbulence, her mind mapping it. This wasn't random chop. It had a pattern, a rhythm. The air was sick, and she could feel its fever. The rain began, not as a drizzle but as a sudden, violent onslaught, hitting the armored windscreen with the sound of thrown gravel. The world outside vanished, replaced by a streaming, opaque curtain of gray. The pilots were flying blind, completely dependent on their instruments, which were beginning to flicker erratically as static electricity from the storm interfered with the electronics. The aircraft bucked again, harder this time. A loud bang echoed from the starboard side as a piece of ice, shed from a prop, struck the fuselage. Foley swore under his breath. Davis was wrestling with the controls, his knuckles white. His movements were jerky, reactive. He was fighting the storm. Eva knew you could not fight a storm. You had to yield to it, feel its currents, and use its own energy to pass through it. They were entering the rotor wash zone she had warned them about, the violent, churning air on the downwind side of the mountains. The aircraft was no longer flying. It was being flown by the storm, and the pilots were just passengers with a better view. Eva braced herself. The worst was yet to come. The world dropped away. It wasn't turbulence. It was a fall. The microburst she had predicted slammed down on the C-130 like the fist of God. A column of cold, dense air punched the aircraft out of the sky. For a heart-stopping second, everyone in the plane was weightless. Loose equipment in the cargo bay crashed against the ceiling. The piercing shriek of the stall warning horn filled the cockpit, a sound that signaled the absolute loss of aerodynamic lift. "Mayday, mayday, mayday!" Foley screamed into the radio, his voice cracking with panic. Goliath 2-2 is in an uncontrolled descent. The plane plunged thousands of feet in mere seconds. Major Davis, caught off guard, was thrown forward and upward. His helmeted head smashed into the overhead switch panel with a sickening crack. He slumped back into his seat, unconscious, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle against the console. The yoke was free, and the aircraft, already in a stall, began to roll into a graveyard spiral. Red warning lights flashed across the entire console, a cacophony of alarms blaring in unison. They were a falling, screaming brick of metal. Foley grabbed his yoke with both hands, his face a mask of terror. He was pulling back hard, a fatal mistake in a stall, deepening it, driving them toward the ground even faster. "Pull up! Pull up!" he yelled, to himself, to the plane, to a god he'd suddenly found. In that maelstrom of noise and terror, Eva moved. There was no hesitation. Her training, her instincts, her entire being took over. She unbuckled her 4-point harness in a single, fluid motion. The violent G-forces of the spiral tried to pin her to her seat, but she used the plane's lurching motion to propel herself forward, moving with the impossible grace of a cat. She wedged herself between the two pilot seats, the cockpit bucking around her like a wild animal. She didn't shout. She didn't grab for the controls. She placed a firm hand on Foley's shoulder. Her voice cut through the alarms and his panic, calm and absolute, a sliver of steel in the chaos. "Let go of the yoke." Foley stared at her, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. "We're going down." "Let go," she repeated, her voice dropping lower, imbued with an authority that was primal. She reached over and pushed the yoke forward herself, breaking the stall. The nose dipped violently, and the terrifying stall horn finally fell silent. The aircraft was now in a steep dive, but it was flying again. It was controllable. "I have the aircraft," she said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. Her left hand was on the yoke, her right on the throttle quadrant. Foley, shocked into submission, let his hands fall away. The C-130 was hers. They were still plummeting toward the unseen mountains below, but for the first time since entering the storm, someone was actually flying the plane. With the aircraft under her control, Eva's mind became a cold, clear instrument. The chaos in the cockpit receded into the background. The alarms were just data now. The storm was an equation to be solved. Her hands moved with practiced certainty over the controls, a surgeon saving a patient. She pushed the throttles for all 4 engines to the firewall, trading altitude for airspeed. The scream of the turboprops intensified, a roar of defiance against the storm. She eased back on the yoke, feeling for the edge of the flight envelope, the delicate boundary between flying and falling. The C-130 shuddered, its wings biting into the turbulent air, and slowly, painstakingly, the dive began to shallow. The altimeter unwound with terrifying speed. 10,000 feet. 9, 8. Outside, the world was a black, roaring void. Her eyes darted across the instruments, absorbing information. Airspeed, attitude, engine temperature, hydraulic pressure. She saw the warning light for the portside hydraulics flicker, confirming the leak she'd spotted. She mentally filed it away, another variable in the complex problem of survival. In the Tactical Operations Center back at FOB Nightingale, the mood was grim. Goliath 2-2's icon had turned red on the main screen, then vanished. Its last reported altitude was 9,000 feet and dropping at a rate the system flagged as unsurvivable. Colonel Madsen stood before the screen, his face pale, his knuckles white where he gripped the back of a chair. "Get me anything," he commanded the room. A transponder squawk, a radio click, anything. The comms officer shook his head. "Nothing, sir. Just static. The storm's blocking all transmissions." Madsen stared at the empty space on the map where the icon had been. He had sent them out. He had dismissed the warning. The weight of the 14 souls aboard, 2 pilots, a loadmaster, a mission coordinator, and the 10 men of Hammerfall team they were supposed to save, settled on his shoulders like a physical shroud. He was already composing the first of the letters home in his head. On the ground, Master Sergeant Thorne and his men huddled behind a cluster of rocks as enemy tracers cut through the dust-choked air. The storm had arrived, but it brought no cover, only a howling wind that drove sand into their eyes and weapons. Their last communication from Goliath had been a panicked, partial mayday call, cut short. "Anything, Sparks?" Thorne yelled to his radio man over the wind. The radio man shook his head, pulling his headset off. "Dead, Top. Nothing but static. They're gone." Hope, a fragile commodity in this place, evaporated. Thorne chambered a fresh round. "All right," he shouted to his team. "Conserve your ammo. We're on our own. Make every shot count." They were preparing to sell their lives dearly. Back in the cockpit of the ghost plane, Eva had stabilized the aircraft at just under 4,000 feet. They were skimming the treetops, but they were level. Captain Foley sat in the co-pilot seat, staring at her, his panic replaced by a profound, shell-shocked awe. He watched her hands on the controls, the minute, precise adjustments she made, anticipating the plane's every move, countering the storm's every blow. She wasn't just flying the plane. She was dancing with it. She was alive in a way he had never seen before. The terrain-following radar flickered to life, painting a terrifying, high-resolution image of the canyon walls rushing past them on either side. They were deep inside the mountain range, far off course, trapped beneath the storm's raging ceiling. The planned extraction zone was miles away and a vertical impossibility to reach. They were alive, but they were caged. Eva scanned the radar display, her mind racing, looking not for a way out, but for a way through. Their situation was dire. They were boxed in by granite and storm, flying a crippled cargo plane at an altitude where a single mistake would be fatal. The planned LZ was on a plateau 5,000 feet above them, an impossible climb through the heart of the storm's shear zone. To Foley, it was checkmate. Their brief survival was merely a prelude to a slightly delayed death. "We have to turn back," he stammered, his voice thin. "We can't make it." Eva ignored him. Her eyes were locked on the green, glowing topography of the radar screen. She wasn't looking for the designated landing zone. That was a place on a map, a fiction created in a safe briefing room. She was looking for what the terrain was giving her now. Her finger traced a thin, winding line on the screen, a tributary canyon that branched off from their current path. "There," she said, her voice calm. "That's our LZ." Foley leaned forward, his eyes widening in disbelief. That's a dry riverbed. It's too short, it's curved, and the approach is blind. It's a coffin corner. The manual says we need at least 3,000 feet of clear, flat ground. The manual was written for pilots, not for this storm, Eva replied, her hands already banking the huge aircraft into the narrow tributary. The wingtips seemed to scrape the canyon wall, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. "The manual is irrelevant." She began the pivotal maneuver, a sequence of actions so far outside standard operating procedure that it constituted a form of aviation heresy. She couldn't make a standard, gradual descent. There wasn't room. She needed to shed altitude and airspeed immediately. She dropped the landing gear, a move that created massive drag. Then she extended the flaps to their maximum landing configuration. The aircraft shuddered, protesting violently. But that wasn't enough. With her left hand steady on the yoke, her right hand moved to the propeller control levers. She pulled them back, shifting the massive blades from a flight pitch to a beta range, turning them into giant air brakes. The four engines didn't just whine. They screamed, a guttural metallic howl of protest. The deceleration was brutal, throwing them forward against their harnesses. The C-130 was now falling more than it was flying, a controlled near-vertical drop. It was a maneuver a fighter pilot might use, not something a 75-ton cargo plane was ever designed to do. She was flying the Hercules with the aggressive precision of a much smaller, nimbler aircraft, using every ounce of her knowledge of its hidden capabilities. She held it right on the edge of a stall, a high-wire act with no safety net, the canyon floor rushing up to meet them. The landing was not a landing. It was an arrival. Eva kicked the rudder hard at the last second, crabbing the aircraft to align with the curve of the riverbed. The C-130 slammed onto the gravelly ground with a deafening shriek of tortured metal. The main landing gear on the port side, weakened by the hydraulic leak and the stress of the maneuver, collapsed entirely. The plane slewed sideways, its wingtip digging into the canyon wall, carving a long, fiery trench as sparks rained down like a meteor shower. The aircraft shuddered to a violent halt, tilted at a precarious angle, its nose just feet from a sheer rock face. The silence that followed the engine's shutdown was more shocking than the noise. Then, a new sound began. The sharp crack of rifle fire from the canyon rim above, and the ping of bullets striking the fuselage. "They're here. They're firing on us," Foley yelled, ducking down behind the instrument panel. Eva didn't flinch. Her work wasn't done. She didn't shut down the engines. Instead, she pushed the throttles for engines 1 and 4, the 2 outboard engines on the intact side, to their maximum power. The propellers roared to life, creating a colossal wall of wind and dust. The prop wash kicked up a thick, impenetrable cloud of sand and gravel, a makeshift smokescreen that completely obscured the aircraft from the enemy shooters on the ridge. In the cargo bay, Airman Ben Carter was already on his feet. The crash had thrown him against the bulkhead, but adrenaline erased the pain. He saw the red ramp light illuminate. Through his headset, he heard Eva's voice, as calm as if she were ordering lunch. "Drop the ramp, Airman. Get them aboard. You have 90 seconds. Inspired by her impossible calm, Ben's own fear vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He hit the ramp controls. The massive door lowered with a hydraulic hiss, grounding itself on the rocky earth. He stood at the edge, his rifle up, peering into the swirling dust cloud. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, shapes emerged from the gloom. The exhausted, battered men of Hammerfall, running, stumbling, dragging their wounded comrades toward the sanctuary of the plane. "Go! Go! Go!" Ben screamed, his voice raw. He reached out, grabbing the first soldier and hauling him inside. Master Sergeant Thorne was the last one on, providing cover fire with his rifle. Bullets zipped past the ramp, thudding into the plane's armored skin. "We're on," Thorne yelled, collapsing into the bay. "Everyone's on. Ramp up," Eva's voice commanded. Ben slammed the button. The ramp began to rise, sealing them inside their metal refuge. Eva now faced her final challenge. Taking off from a runway that wasn't a runway, in a crippled plane with zero room for error. She pushed the throttles for all 4 engines to the firewall. The C-130 strained against its brakes, a chained beast desperate to be free. Then she released them. The plane leaped forward, accelerating with astonishing speed on the short, uneven stretch of ground. The collapsed landing gear dragged, screaming and tearing, but the raw power of the engines dragged it forward. They were headed straight for the canyon wall. At the last possible second, Eva pulled back on the yoke. The C-130, groaning in every rivet and spar, clawed its way into the air. The ascent was a desperate, clawing fight for every inch of altitude. The C-130, battered and bleeding hydraulic fluid, shuddered as Eva coaxed it skyward. She kept the plane in a steep, spiraling climb, using the narrow confines of the canyon to shield them from the worst of the storm's crosswinds. Debris from the collapsed landing gear rattled in the wheel well, a constant, jarring reminder of how close to disaster they were. Finally, they broke through the top layer of the storm cloud, bursting into the serene, impossible calm of the upper atmosphere. The moonlight was brilliant, illuminating a sea of roiling clouds below them. The violence was over. In the cockpit, the only sounds were the steady hum of the 3 good engines, the whine of the damaged one, and a constellation of beeping caution lights. Foley, who had been holding his breath for the entire takeoff, finally let it out in a long, ragged sigh. He turned to look at the woman in the pilot's seat. Her face was illuminated by the soft green glow of the instruments. She was still focused, running a post-takeoff checklist in her head, her expression as calm and unreadable as ever. "My God," Foley breathed, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on fear. "I've never seen flying like that. Not in simulators, not anywhere. Who are you?" Before Eva could answer, the internal comm crackled to life. It was Master Sergeant Thorne from the cargo bay. His voice was rough with exhaustion and awe. "Cockpit, this is Hammerfall Lead. I don't know who the hell is flying this bird, but on behalf of my team, you are a goddamn artist. We're requesting your call sign. We owe you our lives, and I want a name to put in my report." There was a moment of silence. Eva's hands were steady on the controls. She had no call sign, not anymore. She was just Captain Rostova, mission coordinator. But from his station near the cargo ramp, Airman Ben Carter keyed his mic. He remembered the unique patch on her shoulder, the single, sharp silver wing. "Hammerfall, be advised." Ben's young voice was clear and steady over the net. "The pilot's call sign is Valkyrie." The name hung in the air, electric. Back in the TOC at FOB Nightingale, the controller, a young lieutenant, repeated the transmission to the stunned room. "Sir, Goliath 2-2 is back on the scope. They're airborne and they're reporting their pilot's call sign as Valkyrie." Colonel Madsen stared, uncomprehending. But in the back of the room, an old chief warrant officer, a man who had been maintaining aircraft since before the lieutenant was born, froze. He slowly pushed himself up from his chair. "Valkyrie?" he whispered, his voice raspy with disbelief. "Can't be. There was only one Valkyrie. Flew the X-49A prototypes out at Edwards. A test pilot. Had ice in her veins. Eva Rostova. General Viper Rostova's daughter. Legend said she could make a brick fly. Heard she washed out. Refused to sign off on a flight system she said was unstable. The brass buried her." Madsen's head snapped toward the chief, then back to the screen. He turned to his aide. "Get me Captain Rostova's file. Now." A few keystrokes brought it up on his personal terminal. He read it, his face slowly losing all its color. The commendations, the flight hours in experimental craft, the glowing reviews from legendary aviators. And then the final entry, a charge of gross insubordination, a recommendation for dismissal overturned by a 4-star general, and a final, quiet reassignment to Air Mobility Command, Logistics Division. He had put a living legend, a pilot of unparalleled skill, on his plane and called her dead weight. He felt a cold dread wash over him, followed by a profound, humbling wave of awe. The landing at FOB Nightingale was a masterclass in control. With one main gear collapsed and hydraulic pressure failing, a normal pilot would have declared an emergency and hoped for the best. Eva simply declared her intentions. She requested a foamed runway, not as a panicked plea, but as a logistical requirement. She flew the final approach with unnerving precision, holding the left wing high to compensate for the missing gear. She touched down on the right wheel first, a whisper of rubber on pavement, holding the left side off the ground for as long as aerodynamically possible. When it finally settled, it was with a controlled, grinding slide onto the waiting foam, the aircraft coming to a stop perfectly on the runway's centerline. The fire crews, who had been expecting a catastrophe, just stood and watched. The moment the engines spooled down, the silence was absolute. Eva methodically went through the shutdown checklist, her movements economical and precise. She didn't look at Foley. She didn't say a word. She had done her job. She had brought the plane and its passengers home. Her part was over. She unbuckled and prepared to deplane, the stoic mask firmly back in place. When the crew door opened, the first thing she saw was Hammerfall team. They weren't rushing for the medical tents. They were standing in a perfect formation on the tarmac, their faces bruised and grimy, their uniforms torn. As Eva appeared in the doorway, Master Sergeant Thorne called them to attention. He took one step forward, raised his hand to his brow, and rendered a slow, formal salute. It was a gesture of profound respect, a warrior's acknowledgement of another. The rest of his team followed suit. Eva paused on the steps, her gaze meeting Thorne's. She gave a single, crisp nod in return. It was all the communication they needed. At the bottom of the stairs stood Colonel Madsen. The arrogance and dismissiveness were gone, stripped away by the night's events. He looked from the shattered, broken aircraft to the faces of the men it had saved, and then to the quiet captain standing before him. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? He had been wrong in a way that could have cost 16 lives. His rigid adherence to protocol had almost led to disaster. In the end, he just stood there, holding her gaze, and gave a short, sharp nod. It was an admission, an apology, and a thank you, all bound up in one silent gesture. Eva walked past him without breaking her stride. She didn't need his apology. She didn't need his praise. Her vindication was in the hum of the cooling engines and the steady breathing of the men who were alive because of her skill. She stopped beside the nose of the Hercules, the place where her hand had rested hours before. She laid her palm flat against the scarred, warm metal of the fuselage, a silent communion with the machine she had pushed beyond its limits. Quiet thank you. Then, she turned and walked away from the floodlights and the gathering crowd, a solitary figure moving toward the quiet shadows of the base. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon, and in the cool, pre-dawn air, the legend of Valkyrie was being whispered back to life.